Dragons of Autumn Twilight, Chapter 6. Night in a Cave. Dissension. Tanis decides. A chill wind began to blow across the lake. Storm clouds rolled across the sky from the north, obliterating the gaping black holes left by the fallen stars. The companions hunched down in the boat, pulling their cloaks tighter around them as the rain spattered down. Caramon joined Sturm at the oars. The big warrior tried to talk to the knight, but Sturm ignored him. He rowed in grim silence, occasionally muttering to himself in Solomanic. "Sturm, there, between the great rocks to the left," Tanis called out, pointing. Sturm and Caramon pulled hard. The rain made sighting the landmark rocks difficult, and, for a moment, it seemed that they had lost their way in the darkness. Then the rocks suddenly loomed ahead. Sturm and Caramon brought the boat around. Tanis sprang out over the side and pulled it to shore. Torrents of rain lashed down. The companions climbed from the boat, wet and chilled. They had to lift the dwarf out. Flint was stiff as a dead goblin from fear. Riverwind and Caramon hid the boat in the thick underbrush. Tanis led the rest up a rocky trail to a small opening in the cliff face. Goldman looked at the opening dubiously. It seemed to be no more than a large crack in the surface of the cliff. Inside, however, the cave was large enough for all of them to stretch out comfortably.
"Nice home,"
Tasselhoff glanced around.
"Not much in the way of furniture."
Tanis grinned at the kender. "It will do for the night. I don't think even the dwarf will complain about this. If he does, we'll send him back to sleep in the boat." Tas flashed his own smile back at the half-elf. It was good to see the old Tanis back. He had thought his friend unusually moody and indecisive, not the strong leader he had remembered from earlier days. Now that they were on the road, the glint was back in the half-elf's eyes. He had come out of his brooding shell and was taking charge, slipping back into his accustomed role. He needed this adventure to get his mind off his problems, whatever those might be. The kender, who had never been able to understand Tanis's inner turmoil, was glad that this adventure had come along. Caramon carried his brother from the boat and laid him down gently as he could on the soft, warm sand that covered the floor in the cave, while Riverwind started a fire. The wet wood crackled and spit, but soon caught fire. The smoke curled upward toward the ceiling and drifted out through a crack. The plainsman covered the cave's entrance with brush and fallen tree branches, hiding the light from the fire and effectively keeping out the rain. "He fits well," Tanis thought as he watched the barbarian work. "He could almost be one of us." Sighing, the half-elf turned his attention to Raceland. Kneeling down beside him, he looked at the young mage with concern. Raceland's pale face, reflected in the flickering firelight, reminded the half-elf of a time he and Flint and Caramon had barely rescued Raceland from a vicious mob intent on burning the mage at the stake. Raceland had attempted to expose a charlatan cleric who was bilking the villagers out of their money. Instead of turning on the cleric, the villagers had turned on Raceland. And Tanis had told Flint, people want to believe in something. Caramon busied himself around his brother, placing his own heavy cloak over his shoulders. Raceland's body was racked by coughing spasms, and blood trickled from his mouth. His eyes gleamed feverishly. Goldmoon knelt beside him, a cup of wine in her hand. "Can you drink this?" she asked him gently. Raceland shook his head, tried to speak, coughed, and pushed her hand away. Goldmoon looked up at Tanis. "Perhaps my staff?" she asked. "No," Raceland choked. He motioned for Tanis to come near him. Even sitting next to him, Tanis could barely hear the mage's words. His broken sentences were interrupted by great gasps for air and fits of coughing. "The staff will not heal me, Tanis," he whispered. "Do not waste it on me. If it is a blessed artifact, its sacred power is limited. My body was my sacrifice for my magic. The damage is permanent. Nothing can help. His voice died, his eyes closed. The fire suddenly flared as wind whirled around the cavern. Tanis looked up to see Sturm pulling the branches aside and entering the cave, half carrying Flint, who stumbled along on unsteady feet. Sturm dumped him down beside the fire. Both were soaking wet. Sturm was clearly out of patience with the dwarf, and, as Tanis noted, with the entire group. Tanis watched him with concern, recognizing the signs of a dark depression that sometimes overwhelmed the knight. Sturm liked orderly, the well-disciplined. The disappearance of the stars, the disturbance of the natural order of things, had shaken him badly. Tasselhoff wrapped a blanket around the dwarf, who sat huddled on the cave floor, his teeth chattering in his head so that his helm rattled. "Boat!" was all he could say. Tass poured him a cup of wine, which the dwarf drank greedily. Sturm looked at Flint in disgust. "I'll take first watch," he said, and moved toward the mouth of the cave. Riverwind rose to his feet. "I will watch with you," he said harshly. Sturm froze, then turned slowly to face the plainsman. Tanis could see the knight's face, etched in sharp relief by the firelight. Dark lines carved around the stern mouth. Although shorter in stature than Riverwind, the knight's air of nobility and the rigidity of his stance made the two appear almost equal. "I am a knight of Solomania," Sturm said. "My word is my honor, and my honor is my life. I gave my word back at the inn that I would protect you and your lady. If you choose to dispute my word, you dispute my honor, and therefore insult me. I cannot allow that insult to remain between us." "Sturm!" Tanis was on his feet. Never taking his eyes from the plainsman, the knight raised his hand. "Don't interfere, Tanis," Sturm said. "Well, what will it be? Swords? Knives? How do you barbarians fight?" Riverwind's stoic expression did not change. He regarded the knight with intense, dark eyes. Then he spoke, choosing his words carefully. "I did not mean to question your honor. I do not know men and their cities, and I tell you plainly, I am afraid. It is my fear that makes me speak thus. I have been afraid ever since the blue crystal staff was given to me. Most of all, I am afraid for Goldmoon." The plainsman looked over at the woman, his eyes reflecting the glowing fire. "Without her, I die. How could I trust?" His voice failed. The stoic mask cracked and crumbled from the pain and weariness. His knees buckled and pitched forward. Sturm caught him. "You couldn't," the knight said. "I understand. You are tired, and you have been sick." He helped Tanis lay the plainsman at the back of the cave. "Rest now. I will stand watch." The knight shoved aside the brush and, without saying another word, stepped outside into the rain. Goldmoon had listened to the altercation in silence. Now she moved their meager possessions to the back of the cave and knelt down beside Riverwind's side. He put his arm around her and held her close, burying his face in her silver gold hair. The two settled in the shadows of the cave. Wrapped in Riverwind's fur cape, they were soon asleep, Goldmoon's head resting on her warrior's chest. Tanis breathed a sigh of relief and turned back to Raceland. The mage had fallen into a fitful sleep. Sometimes he murmured strange words in the language of magic, his hand reaching out to touch his staff. Tanis glanced around at the others. Tasselhoff was sitting near the fire, sorting through his acquired objects. He sat cross-legged, the treasures on the cave floor in front of him. Tanis could make out glittering rings, a few unusual coins, a feather from a goat-sucker bird, pieces of a twine, a bead of necklace, a soap doll, and a whistle. One of the rings looked familiar. It was a ring of elven make given Tanis a long time ago by someone he kept on the borders of his mind. It was a finely carved, delicate ring of golden, clinging ivy leaves. Tanis crept over to the kender, walking softly to keep from waking the others. "Tass," he tapped the kender on the shoulder and pointed. "My ring?"
"It is?"
asked Tasselhoff with wide-eyed innocence.
"Is this yours? I'm glad I found it. You must have dropped it at the inn."
Tanis took the ring with a wry smile, then settled down next to the Kender. Have you got a map of this area, Tass? The Kender's eyes shone.
Map? Yes, Tanis, of course.
He swept up all his valuables, dumped them back into his pouch, and pulled out a hand-carved wooden scroll case from another pouch. He drew forth a sheaf of maps. Tanis had seen the Kender's collection before, but it never failed to astonish him. There must have been 100, drawn on everything from fine parchment to soft kid leather to a huge palmetto leaf.
I thought you knew every tree personally around these parts, Tanis.
Tasselhoff sorted through his maps, his eyes occasionally lingering on his favorite. The half-elf shook his head. I've lived here for many years, he said. But, let's face it, I don't know any of the dark and secret paths.
You won't find many to Haven.
Taz pulled out a map from his pile and smoothed it out on the cave floor.
The Haven's road through Solace Vale is quickest. That's for certain.
Tanis studied the map by the light of the dying campfire. You're right, he said. The road is not only the quickest, it seems to be the only passable route for several miles ahead. Both south and north of us lie the Carlos Mountains. No passes there. Frowning, Tanis rolled up the map and handed it back, which is exactly what the Theracrat will figure. Tasselhoff yawned.
Well,
he said, putting the map back carefully into his case.
It's a problem that will be solved by wiser heads than mine. I'm along for the fun.
Tucking the case back into the pouch, the Kender laid down on the cave floor, drew his legs up beneath his chin, and was soon sleeping the peaceful sleep of small children and animals. Tanis looked at him with envy. Although aching with weariness, he couldn't relax enough for sleep. Most of the others had dropped off, all but the warrior watching over his brother. Tanis walked over to Caramon. Turn in, he whispered. I'll watch Raceland. No, the big warrior said. Reaching out, he gently pulled the cloak up closer around his brother's shoulders. He might need me. But you've got to get some sleep. I will, Caramon grinned. Go get some sleep yourself, nursemaid. Your children are fine. Look, even the dwarf is out cold. I don't have to look, Tanis said. The Theocrat can probably hear him snoring in solace. Well, my friend, this reunion was not much like what we planned 5 years ago. What is? Caramon asked softly, glancing down at his brother. Tanis patted the man's arm, then lay down and rolled up in his own cloak, and at last fell asleep. The night passed, slowly for those on watch, swiftly for those asleep. Caramon relieved Sturm, Tanis relieved Caramon. The storm continued unbated all night, the wind whipping the lake into a white-capped sea. Lightning branched through the darkness like flaming trees. Thunder rumbled continually. The storm finally blew itself out by morning, and the half-elf watched the day dawn, gray and chill. The rain had ended, but the storm cloud still hung low. No sun appeared in the sky. Tanis felt a growing sense of urgency. He could see no end to the storm, clouds massing to the north. Autumn storms were rare, especially ones with this ferocity. The wind was bitter, too, and it seemed odd that the storm came out of the north, when generally they swept east across the plains. Sensitive to the ways of nature, the strange weather upset Tanis nearly as much as Raceland's fallen stars. He felt a need to get going, even though it was early morning yet. He went inside to wake the others. The cave was chill and gloomy in the gray dawn despite the crackling fire. Goldmoon and Tasselhoff were fixing breakfast. Riverwind stood in the back of the cave, shaking out Goldmoon's fur cloak. Tanis glanced at him. The plainsman had been about to say something to Goldmoon as Tanis entered, but fell silent, content staring at her meaningfully as he continued his work. Goldmoon kept her eyes lowered, her face pale and troubled. The barbarian regrets having let himself go last night, Tanis realized. There is not much food, I'm afraid, Goldmoon said, tossing cereal into a pot of boiling water.
Tika's larder wasn't well stocked, Tasselhoff added an apology. We've got a loaf of bread, some dried beef, half a moldy cheese, and the oatmeal. Tika must eat her meals out.
Riverwind and I did not bring any provisions, Goldmoon said. We really didn't expect to make this trip." Tanis was about to ask her more about her song and the staff, but the others started waking up as they smelled food. Kiramon yawned, stretched, and stood up. Walking over to peer into the cookpot, he groaned. "Oatmeal? Is that all?"
"There'll be less for dinner," Tasselhoff grinned. "Tighten your belt. You're gaining weight anyhow."
The big man sighed. The sparse breakfast was cheerless in the cold dawn. Sturm, refusing all offers of food, went outside to keep watch. Tanis could see the knight sitting on a rock, staring gloomily at the dark clouds that trailed wispy fingers along the still water of the lake. Kiramon ate his share of the food quickly, gobbled down his brother's portion, and then appropriated Sturm's when the knight walked out. Then the big man sat, watching wistfully while the rest finished. "You gonna eat that?" he asked, pointing to Flint's share of bread. The dwarf scowled. Tasselhoff, seeing the warrior's eyes roam over to his plate, crammed his bread into his mouth, nearly choking himself in the process. At least it kept him quiet, Tanis thought, glad for the respite from the Kender's shrill voice. Tass had been teasing Flint unmercifully all morning, calling him a sea master and a shipmate, asking him the price of fish and how much he would charge to ferry them back across the lake. Flint finally threw a rock at him, and Tanis sent Tass back down to the lake to scrub out the pans. The half-elf walked to the back of the cave. "How are you this morning, Raceland?" he asked. "We're going to have to be moving out soon." "I'm much better," the mage replied in his soft, whispering voice. He was drinking some herbal concoction of his own making. Tanis could see small, feathery green leaves floating in the steaming water. It gave off a bitter, acrid odor, and Raceland grimaced as he swallowed it. Tasselhoff came bounding back into the cave, pots and tin plates clattering loudly. Tanis gritted his teeth at the noise, started to reprimand the Kender, then changed his mind. It wouldn't do any good. Flint, seeing the tension on Tanis's face, grabbed the pots from the Kender and began packing them away. "Be serious," the dwarf hissed at Tasselhoff, "or I'll take you by the top knot and tie you to a tree as a warning to all Kender." Tass reached out and plucked something from the dwarf's beard.
"Look!"
The Kender held it up gleefully.
"Seaweed!"
Flint, roaring, made a grab for the Kender, but Tass skipped out of the way agilely. "Stop this," Sturm said, glowering at Flint and Tass, his mustache quivering. His dour gaze turned on Tanis. "I could hear these two clear down to the lake. They'll have every goblin and Kryn on us. We've got to get out of here. Well, which way are we headed?" An uneasy silence fell. Everyone stopped what he was doing and looked at Tanis, with the exception of Raceland. The mage was wiping his cup out with a white cloth, cleaning it fastidiously. He continued working, his eyes downcast, as though totally uninterested. Tanis sighed and scratched his beard. "The Theocrat in Solus is corrupt. We know that now. He's using the goblin scum to take control. If he had the staff, he would use it for his own profit. We've searched for a sign of the true gods for years. It seems we may have found one. I am not about to hand it over to that soulless fraud. Tika said she believed that the High Seekers in Haven were still interested in the truth. They may be able to tell us about the staff, where it came from, what its powers are. Tass, give me the map." The Kender, spilling the contents of several pouches on the floor, finally produced the parchment requested. "We are here on the west bank of Crystalmer," Tanis continued. "North and south of us are the branches of the Careless Mountains, which form boundaries of Solus Vale. There are no known passes through either range except through Gateway Pass, south of Solus." "Almost certainly held by goblins," muttered Sturm. "There are passes to the northeast." "That's across the lake," Flint said in horror. "Yes," Tanis kept a straight face. "Across the lake. But those lead to the plains, and I don't believe you want to go in that direction." He glanced to Goldmoon and Riverwind. "The west road goes through the Sentinel Peaks and Shadow Canyon of Haven. That seems to me the obvious direction to take." Sturm frowned. "And if the High Seekers there are as bad as the ones in Solus?" "Then we continue south to Colonesti." Qualinesti, Riverwind scowled. The Elven lands? No. Humans are forbidden to enter. Besides, the way is hidden. A rasping, hissing sound cut into the discussion. Everyone turned to face Raceland as he spoke. There is a way. His voice was soft and mocking. His golden eyes glittered in the cold light of the dawn. The paths of the darkened wood. They lead right to Qualinesti.
The dead?
Tassoff asked eagerly.
Tell me, Caramon.
Shut up, Tass, Sturm snapped. Darkened wood is madness. None who ever enter have returned. You would have us take this prize there, mage? Hold! Tanis spoke sharply. Everyone fell silent. Even Sturm quieted. The knight looked at Tanis's calm, thoughtful face, the almond-shaped eyes that held the wisdom of his many years of wandering. The knight had often tried to resolve within himself why he accepted Tanis's leadership. He was nothing more than a bastard half-elf, after all. He did not come from noble blood, he wore no armor, carried no shield with a proud emblem. Yet Sturm followed him, and loved him, and respected him, as he respected no other living man. Life was a dark shroud to the Soulmatic Knight. He could not pretend to ever know or understand it except through the code of the knights that he lived by. Est solaris oth mythos. My honor is my life. The code defined honor and was more complete and detailed and strict than any known to Krynn. The code had held true for 700 years, but Sturm's secret fear was that someday, in the final battle, the code would have no answers. He knew that if that day came, Tanis would be at his side, holding the crumbling world together. For while Sturm followed the code, Tanis lived it. Tanis's voice brought the knight's thoughts back to the present. I remind all of you that this staff is not our prize. The staff rightfully belongs to Goldmoon, if it belongs to anyone. We have no more right to it than the Theocrat of Solus. Tanis turned to Goldmoon. What is your will, lady? Goldmoon stared from Tanis to Sturm, then she looked at Riverwind. You know my mind, he said coldly, but you are Chieftain's daughter. He rose to his feet. Ignoring her pleading gaze, he stalked outside. What does that mean? Tanis asked. He wants us to leave you. Take the staff to Haven, Goldmoon answered, her voice low. He says you are adding to our danger. We would be safer on our own. Adding to your danger? Flint exploded. Why, we wouldn't even be here. I wouldn't have nearly drowned again if it hadn't been for... The dwarf began to sputter in his rage. Tanis held up his hand. Enough. He scratched his beard. You will be safer with us. Will you accept our help? I will, Goldmoon answered gravely. For a short distance, at least. Good, Tanis said. Tass, you know your way through Solus Vale. You are our guide. And remember, we're not on a picnic.
Yes, Tanis,
the Kender said, subdued. He gathered his many pouches, hung them around his waist and over his shoulders. Passing Goldmoon, he knelt swiftly and patted her hand. Then he was out the cave entrance. The rest hastily gathered their gear together and followed. It's gonna rain again, Flint grumbled, glancing up at the lowering clouds. I should have stayed in Solus. Muttering, he walked off, adjusting his battle axe on his back. Tanis, waiting for Goldmoon and Riverwind, smiled and shook his head. At least some things never changed, dwarves among them. Riverwind took his packs from Goldmoon and slung them over his shoulder. I've made certain the boat is well hidden and secure, he told Tanis. The stoic mask was in place again this morning, in case we need it. Good idea, Tanis said.
If you will go ahead, Riverwind motioned, I will come behind and cover our tracks.
Tanis started to speak to thank the plainsman, but Riverwind had already turned his back and was beginning his work. Walking up the path, the half-elf shook his head. Behind him, he could hear Goldmoon speaking softly in her own language. Riverwind replied one harsh word. Tanis heard Goldmoon sigh, then all the other words were lost in the sound of a crackling brush as Riverwind obliterated all traces of their passing.